I'll talk to you a little bit about Where Wolves Don't Die. I've had a love-hate relationship with Native American lit. For starters, until about 30 years ago, almost all of the literature about Native people was authored by non-Native people who hadn't even talked to one of us or spent any time in any of our places. Well, that's not Native lit. That's like the white man's Indian. It's an imagining of our experiences rather than a window into our experiences. That's been frustrating. It's starting to change, though. Recently, Louise Erdrich won a Pulitzer Prize. Angeline Bouliz, a New York Times bestselling author. These are Native women authentically grounded in their culture and community, with a wonderful perspective that's showing us something totally different. And there are many, many others to mention. The growth has been phenomenal. There's still lots of non-Native people trying to do Native lit. And there are lots of things to be aware of. And I think there's a tension around this stuff. And I'm happy to go there if you want to have more questions about what is appropriate and what's cultural appropriation and, to go deeper into that. And there's more to say. I don't think there's a simple, easy way to define some of those gray area lines, but there are some lines out there. I do think, as much as possible, we should center and listen to Native voices about Native experiences. Although I have to also say that in recent years, as we've been growing into the space, even a fair amount of the Native authored Native lit are stories of tragedy and trauma. It's stories with characters who lament the culture that they never had because of residential boarding schools and so many other things. And I always found this ironic, like, I speak Ojibwe. We're doing cultural stuff all the time. There's a drum ceremony every weekend. There are powwows every weekend, all around us. And I spend about 6 weeks every summer officiating at these ceremonies and things like that, in addition to all of the time in between. And so the idea that we lost it all is just bizarre. I think it's really coming out of the way all Americans have been conditioned. The few stories about Natives that trickle into the curriculum are stories about sugar-coated version of Chris Columbus and the first Thanksgiving. 87% of educational standards that mention Indigenous anything are stories from before 1900. So there's this assumption that we're something that happened in the past. Last of the blank, and then just fill in the blank with whoever you were talking about. The story of erasure. So much so that especially when I'm traveling out east or in the American South or a foreign country or something, somebody's saying, it's a shame they killed all the Indians. And I'm like, wait a minute, I'm feeling pretty good today. And they're like, oh yeah, that's a good point. That's a really good point. I didn't even think about that. Not even in the consciousness. I wanted to do something different, so I took on, and by the way, most of my work, I have a pretty wide-ranging array of things that I do, right? So I'm trained as a historian. I have written history books, and I've kind of morphed into doing a lot of Ojibwe language works. I have language books, almost all of it nonfiction. This is my first novel. And some people don't make the transition very well, but I think you'll like this one. The story is young adult fiction, as Harry Potter's a young adult fiction, but kind of made for everybody. There's a 15-year-old kid named Ezra who's looking for clues to a murder, but he's finding himself in the process. So the story is a thriller, but it's also kind of a tender coming-of-age story at the same time. As we get to questions, I'm happy to talk more about how I go about it and why I've gone about it and things like that. For starters, all of us humans, and this is another thing I'd like to say about Native Lit, a lot of times there's this tendency to say, go to a Native author to learn about Natives, go to a Black author to learn about the Black experience, go to a white author to learn about humans, to learn about love, to learn about loss, to learn about all the other things. And of course, that's silly. We are all having a human experience. Native Lit is about the human experience. For me, I think all of us, for starters, are dealing with this tension about the deep-held desire to love and be loved, to belong, to find connection and meaning in our lives. And on the other hand, the desire to pull away, to break free, to find freedom and independence. In every friendship, in every marriage, there's often this little tug of war. Somebody's pulling this way and someone's chasing them down. Sometimes the roles reverse. And this is one of the reasons I really wanted to focus on young adult, a teenager protagonist, is that it all comes to a head. It has to. Kids have to break from their parents. They have to do their own thing. If you try to smother that or helicopter that, you end up sapping your kids' independence at their, and belief in themselves and their ability to do adulting. If you just leave them to it, they'll feel neglected and abandoned and all alone in the world. By the way, nobody's got the perfect answer over how to work that one out. It's called parenting, and you got one shot at it, no do-overs, and the goal is don't mess your kids up and good luck, That's one of the things that's going on and why it makes such fertile ground for good lit. At the same time, I wanted to show a story that kind of, showed the living, beautiful culture that we have, even though there'd be a story full of tension and things like that. So as Ezra immediately, he's dealing with a loss that had happened prior to the start of the book. He's also immediately embroiled into this murder mystery, whodunit. He's trying to figure it out, but he's implicated, and his family, to protect him from himself and from the city. It starts in northeast Minneapolis. They send him to go run a trap line with his grandfather in the Canadian wilderness. As this happens, Ezra is trying to find the connection, belonging, and love, and trying to break free, and trying to solve a mystery, and dealing with stuff. It was a lot of fun working on this. By the way, with my 9 kids, it feels like we're launching one every other year. And so I've been going through this. There have been lots of stuff to think about. Even though it's fiction, it was really personal for me doing this kind of writing. Had me thinking about all kinds of things and feeling all kinds of things. Doing fiction well, you have to be very attentive to the craft. It is very different than, nonfiction or even some of the history books. Although when I've written history, I've also wanted those books to go somewhere. Fiction still has to have a strong arc, and the characters too, with their evolution and change. If you just have good guy meets problem, solves it, and wins, that's boring. You're not going to keep anybody that way. And how do we speak to these, higher level threads? So I think there's a real art to doing fiction well. By the way, I read about 50 books a year, and every genre you could imagine, from self-help to kids' books to adult fiction to thrillers and all kinds of things. So I don't stay in any one niche, both with my interests and with my work. I think some other things that I'm trying to do in this work, in literature broadly, we've started to do a little better at holding up more work by female authors, and thank God it's about dang time. That's an emerging effort rather than a completed task. We are starting to hold up more work by people from different gender identities, and thank God it's about dang time. That is a very newly emerging effort that is starting to gain traction, but it is not a completed task. We're starting to hold up more work by people of various minoritized identities, and there too, it's all welcome and just beginning. And by the way, most of the 10,000 banned books are by people of color and people with so-called non-conforming gender identities. It's not always welcome everywhere. I think we've started to have a conversation about what is toxic masculinity, the unhealthy messages we give to boys about what it means to be a man and things like that. But something we haven't done very much of, that we need a lot more of, is just show people what would healthy masculinity look like. What would it look like for a boy coming of age, going through the things to arrive at something healthier and different? And I do think that this says something about that too. And I certainly think about this with my own kids a lot. We have 5 boys and 4 girls. Physical and psychological warfare from all of them all along. Happier to take you deeper into the book as well when we get to some questions. Maybe a couple things that might be helpful. I'd mentioned just in my own introduction how we have a clan system. Ezra's of the Wolf clan. And so that's both like a family membership, but it's also kind of a running metaphor in the book. By the way, what most people have heard about wolves, like the structure of a wolf pack, is that there's an alpha male that dominates the others and leads, and then a new one can challenge them and take over. And it's all completely false. It was based upon one study of wolves in captivity. And wolf packs in the wild are just families. It's just mom, dad, and kids. They hunt cooperatively. They mate for life. They solve problems together. They do not compete over who gets to rule. By the way, if somebody's giving you the message about be the alpha, be the strong one, dominate and lead, their information's all wrong. They're not healthy wolves. They're literally living in a cage, which is where that study came from. Ezra's kind of going through things, and I don't know, I can read a little bit. I won't do too much because you got the book to read, and there's spoilers in nearly every chapter, so can't give you too many of those, but I'll do a little bit. All right, so weasel is an animal like that long, and they're small, but they're actually a predator. They got sharp little teeth, and they hunt mice, and they'll eat like more than their own body weight in mice. Next up, family is minks, martens, and the biggest one is a fisher. So they're as big as an otter, but they're actually a pretty ferocious predator. All right, so you'll need to know what a fisher is. Grandpa Liam, who's probably the funnest character to write. By the way, something else that often happens in YA Lit is it's like Mean Girls. You know what I mean? Like all of the characters and all of the dramas, like school lunchroom and bully things. In our lives, we have people of every age and all kinds of things. So there are strong, well-developed grandparent characters and parent characters and things like that in this one too. So Liam is the grandpa, and he is a hoot. At this point in time, they're a little bit like they've gone from northeast Minneapolis to the res, and they're out in the woods, and they've been running trapline for a while, so they're kind of in a rhythm with it. And this is right before they were going to pull traps. For our last trip to Chief's Ridge, that's kind of where the trap line is, Grandpa Liam and I got to the cabin right at sunset. We planned a couple more weeks trapping before we pulled our sets and closed up for the season. In the fading golden light, we could see footprints all over the yard, in front of the cabin, and up to the shed. They were smaller than a wolf, fox, or coyote, but I couldn't be sure what they were. Grandpa Liam gestured with his mitten. Ezra, they're fisher tracks. All over. They must be scavenging. I bet there's enough residual scent from our previous kills in the shed to keep them poking around. We'll have to be extra careful with our food and hide caching, and we should set a couple sets right on the wall of the shed itself. If they get brave enough to come raiding, we'll be ready. You make the sets. I nodded and brought our supplies in the cabin. Then I spent 30 minutes tacking up fisher sets. I had to finish up with a flashlight in the fading light. I noticed a strong odor coming from the shed, acrid and penetrating. It smelled kind of like skunk, but distinct and oddly stronger. When I came in, Grandpa Liam was working on supper over the drawlet. That's just a stove that is wood-fired and can be used for both cooking and heating. In his suspenders and dickies. What's that weird smell in the shed? Did you notice it? He laughed. Yeah, it's those fishers. They have one of the strongest scent glands in the entire forest. They must have been spraying around in the shed. Once they spray something down, no other predator will touch it. That's how they protect their kills from wolves and bears. Since we were just back from the res, Grandpa Liam had fresh pork chops and potatoes for supper. It was a quick pleasure to finish that off. I read Tracts by Louise Erdrich for a while. The tales of Eli and Nectar somehow reminded me of Grandpa Liam. In the morning, I woke first for a change, eager to check my fisher sets. I stoked the coals in the drawlet, added a couple logs, then slipped on my muck boots and a jacket and went outside. The first hints of dawn were in the sky, but it was still pretty dark, and the overcast sky blunted the first light. But I could see a dark shape where I made the first fisher set on the side of the shed. I strode up quickly, excited at the prospect of a successful kill. Then came a blood-curdling scream from the shed. There is no way to properly describe that sound. It was supernatural, like the worst witch sound in The Conjuring or the Blair Witch Project, only louder. I whipped around faster than a lynx on a snowshoe hare and bolted for the cabin, casting one terrified glance over my shoulder just in time to see a large fisher charging straight at me. An adult fisher can easily weigh 15 pounds, but they grow to 3 feet in length and look much larger in their winter fur, especially when they charge you before you even had a chance to pee first thing in the morning. His first bite caught my jacket from the back before I could get to the cabin door. I could feel him pulling and shaking his head, hissing through clenched teeth. The animal was utterly fearless. The cabin door sprang open, and Grandpa Liam whirled around me in long johns and bare feet with the push broom, Buster close behind, yipping and growling, "Drop the coat, boy!" I unzipped and dropped my coat, turning to face the snarling, furry menace attacking it. Grandpa Liam shouted again, "Grab the axe! Hit him with the blunt end!" "Shouldn't I get the .22? "No! He'll be more likely to shoot one of us or Buster. He's too fast to get a decent shot anyways." The fisher lunged at Grandpa Liam now, snapping the broom handle in his teeth. I had no idea something that size could be so powerful. The axe was next to the cabin door, so I seized it and clenched it in both hands, looking for an opportunity. By the way, the family dog previously described is about 7 pounds. The fisher seemed focused on Grandpa Liam now and Buster by his side. I swung once, furtively, out of fear that I might hit Buster. Then I slowed down and watched the pattern of his attack. Feint, hiss, lunge, retreat, repeat. I hoisted the axe above my head and swung hard on his retreat, catching him right on the back of the head. The fisher dropped in the snow. "Stand on his chest, Ez!" Grandpa Liam was breathing hard now, but smiling wide. "Make sure he's not just stunned. Stand on his chest for 3 whole minutes." I did what I was told. When it was over, Grandpa Liam walked up and gave me a hard clap on the shoulder. "There are easier ways to catch a fisher, but I'm glad you're on my side." I smiled and breathed a sigh of relief. "Why did you tell me to hit him with the blunt end?" "An adult fisher is worth $120. There's no need to ruin the hide." I'm sure the look on my face was completely incredulous. "What? I knew you'd get him." We stood there looking at each other for a moment, Grandpa Liam amused and me still in shock. "Look," Grandpa Liam said, motioning back to the shed. There was another fisher already dead in my trap. He turned and strode through the snow, back into the cabin, still in long johns and bare feet, but hollering over his shoulder, "We're off to a great start today."